The rain was a brutal, relentless assault, a deluge of liquid lead falling from a sky bruised and bleeding black. It hammered against Bridget's soaked habit, each drop a cold lash against her skin as she clawed through the mud of a world that had turned its back on her. Her breath was a ragged, desperate sound, a frantic plea lost in the roar of the gale. Behind her, the headlights of the pursuit cut through the dark like the eyes of ancient demons. Ahead, the fortress rose, a mountain of iron and cold stone that offered the only salvation left. She reached the rusted gates, her knuckles raw and bloody as she pounded against the metal. The church had cast her out, a final penance for a sin she never committed, and now her faith was a hollow thing, shivering in the cold. Then the iron groaned. The gates didn't just open, they surrendered. Inside, the air was filtered, smelling of expensive tobacco and the sharp metallic tang of oil and steel. Men stood like statues of dark glass, their black suits perfectly pressed, their eyes holding a stillness that spoke of massacres and old wars. Their presence was an absolute command. And at the center of this storm of men sat Tae Min-Jun. He moved with the weight of a man who owned the very ground he walked on, his face carved from unforgiving granite. He looked at her not with desire but with a terrifying curiosity. A sacred relic had just walked into the heart of a blood-soaked temple. The heavens had opened like a wound, pouring out a deluge so thick it turned the air into a wall of falling lead. Sister Bridget clawed through the mire, her boots heavy with the earth that seemed determined to swallow her whole. The rain was a relentless assault, a cold lash that found every opening in her soaked habit, turning the wool into a frozen weight against her skin. Behind her, the headlights of the pursuit cut through the sheets of water, twin pillars of yellow light that felt like the eyes of ancient demons closing in for the kill. Her breath was a ragged, desperate sound, a frantic prayer whispered into the teeth of the gale, though the words felt hollow in a world that had suddenly become a graveyard of her faith. Ahead, the black orchid rose from the gloom, a mountain of iron and cold stone that clawed at the bruised purple clouds. It was a high-security fortress, a place where the air itself was filtered and expensive, a spire of glass and steel that stood as a monument to a power that did not know the meaning of mercy. Bridget reached the rusted iron gates, her knuckles raw and bloody as she hammered against the metal, her voice a thin cry lost in the roar of the thunder. The mud of the valley clung to her, a stain on her sacred office, a final penance for a betrayal she had never seen coming. The gates groaned, a deep, metallic surrender that vibrated through the very marrow of her bones. They swung wide and she stumbled forward, collapsing onto a heated driveway that spilled a warm, golden light onto the drowning earth. The transition was a sudden, jarring shock. Inside, the world was silent and controlled, smelling of expensive tobacco and the sharp metallic tang of oil and weaponry. Men stood in the shadows like statues of dark glass, their suits dark and fabric whispering of impossible expense. Their presence was an absolute command, their eyes holding a stillness that spoke of massacres and old wars. Bridget lay on the pristine marble, her drenched habit a dark ruin against the chrome fixtures and polished floors that cost more than her entire life. She looked up, her heart a frantic, trapped bird, as the heavy steel doors sealed her in with the very men her world had taught her to fear. She was a sacred relic trapped in a temple of blood, and the sanctuary she had found felt terrifyingly like a tomb. The heavy thud of the steel doors echoed through the hall like a hammer on an anvil, sealing the world of the living away from the sanctuary of the damned. Bridget remained on the marble, her body a broken heap of sodden cloth and shivering limbs. The water from her habit pooled around her, staining the pristine stone, a dark blemish in a world of clinical perfection. Above her stood the men in black, towering figures with eyes like flint, their faces devoid of the mercy she had spent her life preaching. They did not reach down to help her. They simply watched, their silence a crushing weight that filled the air with the scent of ozone and impending violence. "A stray dog has wandered into the sanctuary," one of them murmured, his voice a low, grating sound that held no more warmth than the rain outside. He didn't look at her as a human being, but as an inconvenience, a piece of refuse washed up by the storm that needed to be discarded before it fouled the carpets. Another stepped forward, the light catching the heavy, menacing bulk of a weapon tucked into his waistband, a hard reality that made the air feel thin and sharp. He loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her small frame, his presence a lethal aura that seemed to suck the very heat from her skin. Bridget looked up, her gaze meeting theirs with a desperate, unblinking sincerity, but she found no reflection of her own soul in their dark, bottomless eyes. To them she was an invisible person, a ghost in a white apron of faith who had no place in a fortress built on blood and iron. They began to circle her, their movements economical and certain, a display of power made flesh that made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. They spoke of her as if she were already a corpse, debating the price of her intrusion and the mess her presence would leave behind. The hostility was a physical thing, a coldness that went deeper than the ice in her veins. She was a sacred relic trapped in a temple of monsters, and as the men closed in, the walls of the fortress seemed to shrink, turning her refuge into a cage. Every breath she took felt like a theft, a final penance for daring to seek life in a place that dealt only in death. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the singular, decisive moment when the wolves would finally strike at the lamb. The tension in the hall snapped not with a sound, but with a sudden, oppressive stillness that rippled through the men like a physical blow. The circling wolves halted, their arrogant stances instantly dissolving into a rigid, carved obedience. Bridget felt the shift in the air. The oxygen seemed to flee the room, leaving behind a vacuum of absolute authority. At the far end of the corridor, a shadow detached itself from the gloom, moving with a heavy, deliberate grace that made the marble floor feel like a crumbling throne. Tae Min-Jun did not walk. He colonized the space around him, each step a singular, decisive claim on the earth. He was a silent storm draped in the finest charcoal wool, his suit a dark whisper of impossible expense that shimmered under the dim amber lights of the fortress. As he approached, the light caught the sharp angles of his face, a countenance fashioned from unforgiving granite and severe, unyielding lines. He stopped a few feet from where Bridget lay, his presence a solid, unshakable wall that dwarfed the violence of the men behind him. He looked down at her, and Bridget felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the ice in her marrow. His eyes were dark, bottomless pits holding a chilling stillness, eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires and remained unmoved. They were eyes cold as winter, assessing her not with the lust of the men who had circled her, but with a terrifying, analytical curiosity. He looked at her mud-stained habit, the white linen now a dark ruin, and then at the rosary clutched in her raw, bloody knuckles. It was a meeting of two worlds that should never have touched, a sacred relic cast at the feet of a king of shadows. The silence stretched, a heavy, living entity that seemed to hold the very breath of the world. Min-Jun did not speak to her, he never had to. His presence was a command that required no voice, a power made flesh that demanded total surrender. He studied the trembling woman before him, searching her face for a trick, a price, or a lie, but he found only the steady, unblinking sincerity of a soul with nowhere left to run. In the depths of that cold, impenetrable gaze, a flicker of something unreadable stirred, a momentary crack in the stone. He was the most powerful man in the city's underworld, a predator who had traded his soul for a kingdom of glass, and he was now staring at the only innocent thing left in his blood-soaked temple. One of the men stepped forward, his face a mask of brutal impatience. "Master, the stray is fouled with the filth of the gutter," he growled, his hand hovering near the dark steel at his hip. "The rain will wash the blood from the driveway, but her presence here is a stain on the sanctuary. Let us cast her back to the storm where she belongs." The air in the hall turned to ice as the men looked to their king, their eyes hungry for the singular, decisive violence that usually followed such an intrusion. Bridget lay at Min-Jun's feet, her lungs burning with the frigid air, her sodden habit a dark ruin against the chrome and polished stone. She expected the back of a hand or the cold bite of steel, a final penance for her desperate hope. But Tae Min-Jun remained a statue of unforgiving granite, his gaze never wavering from the trembling woman on the floor. He saw the raw, bloody knuckles clutched around the rosary, and the steady, unblinking sincerity in her bottomless eyes, a look that held no trick, no angle, and no price. The world seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the rhythmic drumming of the deluge against the reinforced glass above. Then his voice cut through the silence, a low rumble that carried the weight of an absolute command. "Let her stay," he said, the words singular and final. A ripple of disbelief crossed the faces of his lieutenants, but no man dared to move. Min-Jun turned his back on the room, his dark suit whispering of impossible expense as he moved toward the private elevator. Tonight, the storm is her sanctuary. Clean the stone and see that she is fed. Bridget was hauled to her feet by hands that held no kindness, only the rigid obedience of the condemned. She was led through a labyrinth of cold, metallic corridors where the air felt filtered and expensive, a world of high-security glass that clawed at the clouds. They thrust her into a small, sterile room, a box of white walls and flickering lights that smelled of bleach and desperation. There was no warmth here, no comfort to be found in the narrow bed or the single thin blanket, yet as the lock echoed in the sudden quiet, she knew the walls were solid. For the first time in days, the hunt had paused. She sank onto the edge of the mattress, the reality of her ruin crashing down on her, and as the flickering neon from the city below cast a red light across the room, she closed her eyes. She had invited the storm into her soul, and in the heart of this blood-soaked fortress she finally slept. High above the sterile cell, in a room filled with the blue luminescence of a dozen screens, Tae Min-Jun sat in a throne of black leather, a silent god in a temple of glass. The storm continued its brutal assault on the fortress, but in here the air was a heavy, filtered stillness that smelled of ozone and absolute power. He did not move. He sat with his elbows on the arms of his chair, his long fingers steepled beneath a chin carved from unforgiving granite. His gaze was fixed on a single monitor, a window into the small white box where the nun now lay. Bridget was a dark ruin against the clinical white of the sheets. She had not removed her habit. She lay on her side, a fallen monument of faith, her body curled as if to protect the tiny spark of life remaining in her marrow. In the grain of the surveillance feed, he watched the rhythmic rise and fall of her shoulders, a fragile cadence that seemed entirely alien in a place built on the sharp, severe lines of war. Min-Jun studied her, his dark eyes holding a chilling stillness that saw beyond the physical. He was a man who understood the world through the lens of transactions and leverage, a king who knew the habits of his residents by the price they paid for their sins. But this woman, this sacred relic who had pounded on his gates with raw, bloody knuckles, demanded a different kind of calculation. He watched the way her hand, even in sleep, remained clutched around the rosary, the beads a final anchor in the swirling chaos of her ruin. He was not looking at her with the hunger of a man who dealt in flesh, but with the profound wonder of a man trying to decipher a language he had never been taught to speak. Kindness was a currency he had never traded, yet here was a creature who had asked for sanctuary without offering an angle or a trick. The blue light of the monitors caught the faint scar on his brow, a mark of the battles that had bought him this kingdom of iron. The silence in the surveillance suite was an entity of its own, sucking the air from the room as he monitored her every breath. He was the protector of this territory, a man who possessed everything but understood nothing of the sincerity displayed on the screen. As the storm raged outside, the master of the fortress remained anchored to the image of the sleeping nun, a singular, decisive stillness that promised that the night was far from over. The scream that tore through the sterile silence of the hallway was a raw, primal thing, a sound of absolute agony that pulled Bridget from the edge of her shallow sleep. She rose from the narrow bed, her limbs heavy and stiff in her sodden habit, and moved toward the door. The lock, which had seemed so final, gave way with a singular, decisive click as she turned the handle. She stepped into the corridor, where the air was cold and heavy with the scent of ozone and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. The light in the hallway was a harsh, clinical white that spilled across the marble floor. At the far end, near the heavy steel doors of the private elevator, a group of men stood like statues of dark glass. At the center of this circle of iron was Tae Min-Jun. He was no longer the silent observer she had seen on the monitors. He was a force of nature made flesh. He stood over a man who had been broken, his black suit rumpled and dusted with the debris of a struggle. Min-Jun's white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. The sleeves rolled up to reveal the corded muscle of his forearms and the edge of the dragon's tail coiling around his wrist. His hands were dark, stained with a wet, crimson reality that dripped onto the pristine stone. He held a heavy black pistol loosely at his side, the barrel still warm from the singular, decisive violence that had just occurred. His face was a mask of cold granite, his eyes holding a chilling stillness that saw only the mission and the cost of betrayal. Bridget stood frozen, her hand clutched around her rosary, her breath a ragged sound in the sudden quiet. She saw the man on the floor, one of the lieutenants who had mocked her at the gate, now reduced to a statue of ruin. Min-Jun turned his head slowly, his dark eyes finding hers. There was no apology in his gaze, no shame for the blood on his hands. There was only the hard, cold truth of the world he ruled. In that look she saw the predator and the king, the man who moved as if the world owed him space. The violence of the last few seconds clung to him like the scent of expensive tobacco, a dangerous charge that filled the narrow space. He stepped toward her, his grip on the gun firm, and Bridget realized with a terrifying certainty that the sanctuary she had sought was a place of blood and iron, where mercy was a currency he had long ago forgotten how to spend. The crimson stains on Tae Min-Jun's knuckles were still wet, a dark testament to the singular, decisive violence that had just shattered the night. He did not look away from Bridget, his gaze holding a chilling stillness that seemed to pierce through the heavy wool of her habit. The air between them was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and the iron tang of fresh blood, a pressure that felt like the world holding its breath before a final collapse. Bridget clutched her rosary, her fingers white against the beads as a strange, unspoken shiver traveled through the very marrow of her bones. He took a step toward her, his movements economical and certain, his presence a solid, unshakable wall that filled the narrow corridor. The black pistol in his hand was an absolute command, yet his eyes held something more terrifying than the weapon. A raw, bottomless curiosity that assessed her not as a victim but as a mystery. He stopped mere inches away, his heat radiating through the frigid air, a physical claim that turned her breath into a ragged plume of white. "You see what I am," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble that scraped against the quiet of the hall. He did not offer an apology or a lie. He stood as power made flesh, a king who had traded his soul for a throne of stone. Bridget did not move, her heart a frantic, trapped bird against the cage of her ribs, yet she did not look away. In the dim, flickering light, she saw the deep exhaustion carved into the sharp angles of his face and the faint scar that bisected his brow, the marks of a man who had walked through hell to protect what was his. An intimate, unguarded tension stretched between them, more visceral than the violence that had preceded it. He reached out, his hand, still dark with the evidence of his war, hovering near her cheek before his fingers brushed a stray strand of hair back from her forehead. The touch was electric, a searing brand that anchored her to the reality of the monster and the man. For a heart-stopping second, the fortress and its assassins vanished, leaving only two souls anchored in a flickering red light, bound by a loyalty that had no price and a need that had no name. Then the mask slammed back into place, cold and impenetrable as he turned toward the darkness, leaving her alone with the echo of his breath and the weight of the storm. The morning rose not with the grace of a new dawn, but as a gray, suffocating shroud that clung to the high-security glass of the fortress. Bridget moved through the cold, metallic corridors of the Black Orchid, her habit a dark, heavy ruin against the clinical perfection of the spire. The air here remained filtered and expensive, a sharp contrast to the damp plaster and stale sense of the world she had left behind. As she walked, she felt the crushing weight of the silence, a stillness that sucked the air from the room and marked her as an intruder in a temple of stone. The men in black suits stood like statues of dark glass at every intersection, their eyes holding a chilling stillness that tracked her every movement. They did not bow, they simply watched with a heavy, analytical gaze, assessing her as a threat or an inconvenience in their world of violence and blood. She was a sacred relic wandering through a kingdom of iron, her presence a jarring blemish against the sharp angles and severe lines of their reality. Every step she took in her worn boots was a rhythmic drumming against the marble, a reminder of the invisible person she was meant to be, now thrust into the center of a silent storm. She reached the grand, heated lobby where the automatic doors slid open and shut for residents who moved as if the world owed them space. There she saw the hierarchy of the fortress laid bare. The staff moved with a quiet, careful desperation, while the men with hard eyes maintained a lethal aura that clung to the very walls. It was a clash of worlds, one of budgeting and quiet solitude, the other of impossible expense and absolute command. At the center of this cold choreography stood Tae Min-Jun. He moved through the lobby with a stiff pride, his perfectly tailored suit a charcoal gray that spoke of a power made flesh. He did not speak to the staff, for his presence alone was a command that forced the world to pay its dues. When his dark, bottomless eyes met hers, the mask of impenetrable stillness remained, yet the electric charge of their midnight encounter still lingered in the frigid air. Bridget realized then that there was no away from this man. Their lives were now chained together in a world of shadows, and the peace of the morning was merely a deceptive blanket over the war to come. The gray shroud of the morning offered no warmth, only a clinical light that exposed every blemish on the fortress of stone. Bridget found Tae Min-Jun in the grand heated lobby, a silent storm in a charcoal gray suit that whispered of impossible expense. He stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, a king surveying a city that lay at his feet, his face a mask of unforgiving granite. The air around him was heavy, a filtered stillness that sucked the noise from the room and forced the world to pay its dues in absolute silence. Bridget did not wait for a dismissal or a command. She crossed the marble floor, her worn boots making a rhythmic drumming that challenged the lethal aura of the spire. She stopped a few feet away, her hand clutched around her rosary, her breath a steady plume in the frigid air. "Why did you let me stay?" she asked, the question hanging cold and sharp between them. Min-Jun did not turn his head, his dark, bottomless eyes fixed on the glittering tapestry of the city below. The silence stretched, a heavy living entity filled with the ghosts of the night and the unspoken shiver of their midnight encounter. He finally spoke, his voice a low, rough rumble that carried the weight of a decade of solitary rule. "In my world, kindness is a weapon, a transaction used to buy something later," he said, the words singular and final. He turned slowly, his gaze a heavy, analytical thing that assessed her with a terrifying curiosity. "People show it only when they want an angle or a price. For days I have searched your face for the trick." He stepped toward her, his presence a solid, unshakable wall that filled her senses with the scent of cedarwood and old wars. "But you did not beg like the others. You stood in the storm and offered a room to a man who had already lost his soul." The truth was a dangerous, sharp-edged thing lodged in the quiet. Bridget saw the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes and the deep self-loathing that he masked with stone. "Nobody deserves to be alone when the wolves are at the door," she replied, her voice soft but firm with a strength that surprised them both. Min-Jun stared at her, a conflict raging in his dark eyes, a flicker of wonder that looked terrifyingly like hope. For a heart-stopping second, the fortress of iron felt like a house, and the predator stood revealed as a man who had forgotten the taste of loyalty without a price. He reached out, his hand hovering near her waist in a firm, possessive claim that was not a question, but an admission of a need he could no longer name. The air in the lower service corridor was thick, smelling of copper and the sharp, metallic tang of cold grease. Bridget walked through the gloom, her habit a dark ruin against the concrete, when a low groan of absolute agony pulled her toward a shadow near the freight elevator. There, slumped against a wall of reinforced steel, sat a guard, his black suit rumpled and stained with a wet, crimson reality. He was young, his face a mask of pale exhaustion, clutching a side that had been opened by a singular, decisive blow. Instinct, a stubborn knot of compassion inherited from a life of service, overrode the fear that had anchored her to the floor. Bridget did not see a man of violence. She saw a human being left to bleed in the dark, abandoned by the very power he served. She knelt on the cold stone, the starched stiffness of her apron a reminder of the invisible person she was meant to be, and reached for the wound. The guard's head snapped up, his eyes holding a raw, feral panic, his hand moving with a lethal speed toward the gun at his hip. "Do not move," she whispered, her voice a steady, unblinking command that stopped the world. She did not wait for his permission. With a strength that surprised her, she tore a strip of white linen from her own sleeve, the fabric whispering of sacrifice as she pressed it against the flow of blood. The room went silent, a heavy living entity that seemed to suck the noise from the spire. The other men in black suits stood like statues of dark glass in the doorway, their eyes holding a chilling stillness as they watched the nun offer sanctuary to a man they had already written off as a corpse. At the edge of the circle stood Tae Min-Jun. He moved like the world owed him space, his presence a solid, unshakable wall as he observed the scene. He did not speak. He watched her long fingers work with an economical certainty, his dark eyes searching her face for the angle or the price. But there was no trick in her expression, only a raw, unguarded admission of need. In that moment, the violence of the fortress was interrupted by a dangerous kind of mercy, and the master of the Black Orchid saw the man beneath the monster in himself reflected in her unwavering light. The white linen of Bridget's sleeve was quickly ruined, blooming with the dark, wet crimson of the man's life. She pressed her weight into the wound, her knuckles white as she fought the flow of blood that threatened to turn the cold stone floor into a lake of red. The guard beneath her was a statue of ruin, his chest heaving in a ragged cadence of agony, his eyes wide and haunted as they scanned the dim light of the corridor. Around them, the men in black stood as statues of dark glass, their faces carved from unforgiving stone, holding a stillness that spoke of old wars and absolute command. They watched the nun with a chilling stillness, assessing her not as a woman of faith, but as an unexplainable force that had dared to interrupt the natural order of their violence. Bridget's own tears fell hot and silent, disappearing into the mud-stained fabric of her habit. She did not cry for fear of the lethal aura that filled the room, but for the profound waste of the human being beneath her hands. She leaned in close, her breath a steady plume against the guard's pale cheek, whispering calm reassurances that were lost to the ears of the others but acted as a firm anchor for the dying man. She was a sacred relic performing a final penance in a temple of shadows, and for a singular, decisive moment, the crushing weight of the fortress seemed to lift. Tae Min-Jun stood at the edge of the circle, a silent storm in a perfectly tailored suit. He moved like the world owed him space, his presence a command that forced the very air to remain filtered and expensive. He watched her long fingers work with an economical certainty, his dark, bottomless eyes searching her face for the angle, the trick, or the price. In his world, kindness was a currency used to buy something later, a transaction of power that always carried a hidden debt. Yet as he watched the tears of the nun fall onto the ruined uniform of his enemy, he found nothing but a steady, unblinking sincerity. The room remained sealed in an absolute silence, the only sound the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the high-security glass far above. Min-Jun felt an unspoken shiver travel through his own marrow, a dangerous electric charge that threatened the impenetrable stillness he had spent a decade building. He saw the man beneath the monster in her gaze, a raw, unguarded admission of trust that he had long ago traded for a kingdom of iron. He did not move to stop her. He simply stood as a solid, unshakable wall, allowing the dangerous kind of mercy to flow through his blood-soaked temple, realizing with a terrifying certainty that the territory he protected was no longer just made of stone and steel. The heavy, filtered air of the corridor seemed to solidify, turning into a singular, suffocating weight as Tae Min-Jun remained anchored to the floor. He did not move. He stood with his hands tucked into the pockets of a suit that whispered of impossible expense, a king carved from unforgiving stone. His gaze was a heavy, analytical thing, tracking the frantic rhythm of Bridget's hands as she continued to fight for the life of a man who was nothing more than an expendable tool in the machinery of his empire. The men in black suits stood like statues of dark glass, their eyes holding a chilling stillness that awaited a command, a dismissal, or a death sentence. But no command came. The only sound in the vast metallic silence was the ragged cadence of the guard's breathing and the wet, rhythmic drumming of blood hitting the marble. Min-Jun watched the tears of the nun disappear into the crimson ruin of her habit, and in that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. He was a man who understood the world through the cold calculus of power and the sharp angles of war, a predator who had never known a loyalty that did not carry a hidden price. Yet, in the dim, flickering light of the service level, he found a steady, unblinking sincerity that bypassed every defense he had built. He saw the raw, bloody knuckles she had used to pound on his gate now used to cradle the head of a common soldier, an act of mercy that was as absolute and terrifying as a singular, decisive gunshot. The room went silent, a black hole of stillness that sucked the noise and the oxygen from the spire. Min-Jun felt an unspoken shiver travel through his marrow, a dangerous electric charge that threatened the impenetrable mask he had worn for a decade. He was observing something rare, a creature of light performing a final penance in a temple of blood. He did not offer help, nor did he offer a kiss of peace. He simply stood as a solid, unshakable wall of heat and shadow, his presence a firm, possessive claim over the entire scene. He realized then that the woman before him was not a weakness to be exploited, but a territory that demanded a protection more visceral than any fortress could provide. The violence of his world had been interrupted by a connection he could not explain, and as he watched her, the master of the Black Orchid knew that the storm had finally entered his house to stay. The heavy, filtered air of the corridor remained a singular, suffocating weight as Tae Min-Jun finally moved. He did not rush. He stepped into the light with a deliberate heavy grace that made the marble floor feel like a crumbling throne. The men in black suits parted like a dark sea, their eyes holding a chilling stillness as their king approached the nun. Bridget remained on her knees, her habit a dark ruin of mud and the wet, crimson reality of the guard she had just saved. She looked up, her heart a frantic, trapped bird as Min-Jun loomed over her, his presence a solid, unshakable wall of heat and shadow. He did not reach out to help her to her feet. Instead, he looked down at the blood on her hands and the steady, unblinking sincerity in her gaze. "In my world nothing is free," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble that carried the weight of an absolute command. "Kindness is a currency and you have spent much of it tonight. You seek sanctuary in a fortress of iron, but a house of blood requires a different kind of tribute." The silence that followed was absolute. A black hole of stillness that sucked the noise from the spire as the men watched the singular, decisive moment of the bargain. Min-Jun leaned in closer, his dark suit whispering of impossible expense, his face a mask of unforgiving granite. "You can stay," he said, the words singular and final. "But you will not be a guest and you will not be a burden. This world is a storm and everyone within these walls must hold the line. You will earn your keep by healing the wounds that my war creates. You will be the light in this temple of shadows, but you will belong to the master of the house." Bridget did not pull away from the intensity of his dark, bottomless eyes. She saw the deep exhaustion carved into his severe lines and the raw, unguarded admission of need that he masked with stone. She realized then that the sanctuary he offered was a cage of gold and lead, a territory where her survival was now inextricably linked to his. "I am not afraid of the work," she replied, her voice soft but firm with a strength that surprised the men of violence surrounding her. Min-Jun gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a firm, possessive claim that sealed the dangerous deal. He turned his back on the scene, his presence a command that forced the world to pay its dues, leaving Bridget to realize that she had not just found a refuge. She had accepted a place at the side of a king who protected what was his with a lethal aura that knew no limit. The night deepened, a heavy shroud of silence settling over the high-security fortress as the storm outside finally transitioned into a rhythmic, distant drumming. Inside her sterile white box, Sister Bridget sat on the edge of the narrow mattress, her heart a frantic, trapped bird slowly finding its rhythm in the quiet. The room was cold, smelling of bleach and the sharp, lingering tang of the copper that had stained her hands and her habit. She remained in her ruined clothing, the starched stiffness of her apron now a dark memory of a life that was no longer hers. Every shadow in the corner seemed to hold the weight of the men in black suits, their eyes holding a chilling stillness that saw her only as a blemish on their kingdom of iron. A soft sound, the singular, decisive slide of metal against metal, pulled her gaze toward the door. She did not move. She sat with her knuckles white around her rosary, her breath a steady plume in the frigid air. No heavy thud followed. No command from a voice scraped raw with violence. Instead, there was only a quiet, absolute stillness that lasted for a heart-stopping second before the sound of retreating footsteps faded into the filtered air of the corridor. Bridget rose, her limbs heavy with the deep exhaustion carved into her marrow, and crossed the small space. She turned the handle, the lock giving way with a smooth, flowing ease that felt like an unguarded admission of trust. When the door swung open, the hallway was empty, a labyrinth of cold stone and flickering lights. But there, resting on the floor just beyond the threshold, was a small tray. It was a simple thing, yet in this temple of blood and impossible expense, it felt like a sacred relic. A single bowl of steaming rice and a cup of tea sat upon the wood, the heat radiating from them a searing brand against the cold. There was no note, no promise of love, and no name attached to the offering. It was care disguised as distance, a mercy that did not require a transaction or an angle. Bridget looked toward the dark end of the hall, where the air felt heavy with the scent of cedarwood and old wars. She knew he was there, a silent storm watching from a throne of glass, his presence a solid, unshakable wall that protected what was his. The tray was a silent pact, a firm, possessive claim that bridged the gap between the sacred and the profane. Bridget ate with raw, bloody knuckles, knowing that while the storm had passed, the war for her soul was just beginning. She was no longer a runaway. She was territory anchored to a man whose mercy was as dangerous as his iron. Outside, the SUVs remained in the shadows, waiting for the singular, decisive moment to reclaim their prize, unaware that the lamb was now guarded by the king of the Black Orchid. The sanctuary was sealed, but as she leaned into the cold, filtered air, she knew the true cost of her stay would be paid in blood. If you want to know how the drama ends, stay tuned for the next episode.